Okay. So I'm recording, just so everybody is aware. And good morning. It's great to have such an amazing amount of people that have joined us today. I'm not even going to try and worry about the time zones, but thank you for joining us. I've put everybody on mute, so please just make sure that you stay on mute, because it obviously will help with the recording, and we can obviously unmute when we get to questions. The format's going to be relatively informal, so please make sure that you can get involved, post in the chat box, and if you've got questions as well, that'd be great. The key for today, as I say, is to have a really good, open, courteous discussion. So keep it, I'm sure we'll all play nice, we keep it nice. And the question that we're going to kind of hope to get to look at today, go through today, is can communication really change behaviour in a crisis? Which is going to be fascinating. So just make sure I can move my screen. Just if you don't know me, I'm Amanda Coleman. I am the founder and director of Amanda Coleman Communications, which is a crisis and risk communication consultancy. I also wrote a book on crisis communication, which came out last year, weirdly, in the middle of a pandemic. And what I've been trying to do as part of kind of learning and developing in terms of crisis is to look at what we can learn, how we can develop. So there was a couple of webinars I did towards the end of last year, and there are 3 that are running at the end of February, this one, and then a couple in the start of March, about sort of areas that you perhaps wouldn't think of in relation to crisis. Remember, if you are, as I mentioned at the start, if you are a CIPR member, that you can claim CPD points for the session. And it'll be available through this, you'll find it on the CIPR's website. So questions, if you've got them in the chat box, I'll be keeping an eye on that so that Shayoni can focus on what she needs to do. And if you want to talk about the session on Twitter, use the hashtag crisis chat. That'd be great, because it'd be great to see some of that. Okay. Really pleased to get some time with Shayoni, because she posted yesterday, I think, about what a busy day she's got. She's a very, very busy lady. I'm so pleased that Shayoni's agreed to talk about this subject today. Shayoni, if you don't know her, is a director and principal consultant at award-winning strategic communications behavioural insights consultancy, Lynn PR. She's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations and of the PRCA, the Public Relations and Communications Association, and is the chair of PRCA Wales. She's also the UK PR. She also represents Wales at the UK PR Council, where she's leading a work stream on ethics. She's a founding member and vice chair of the CIPR's Behavioural Insights Insights Interest Group, to get that right, and a committee member of the CIPR Education and Skills and the Government Communication Service, South Wales and South West and Wales. She's regularly judges industry awards, which is useful if you're looking at going and entering any awards. Then it's useful to obviously listen into what she's going to say today. And she speaks a lot, obviously, about behavioural insights, measurement, evaluation. And if that's not enough, she's also an associate lecturer on the MA in Internal PR and Global Communications Management at Cardiff University. And in 2019 was recognised in Wales Online's 35 under 35 list of top young businesswomen in Wales. So quite a huge amount of things that she's involved with. So I'm going to hand over to Shayoni, who's going to give us a 10-15 minutes kind of roundup about behavioural insights, behavioural communication. And then I've got a load of questions. I've got some questions that people have sent in. But if anybody's got any questions that they want, obviously, then post them as we go through. So brilliant. Shayoni, you might have to unmute yourself, because I've just muted everybody who's joining. And I shall stop sharing.
Before you do that, just to say that I can't share my screen.
I shall make sure you can share your screen.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Amanda. It all feels very overwhelming when you put it into words. I am very, very happy to be here. It is a busy day, but the more people I can talk to about behavioral science, the happier it makes me. And I too am very excited to be here because you are an expert in crisis comms. So I think there's lots we can all learn today.
Right, brilliant. You should be able to do that now.
Perfect, just in time. Thank you. I was running out of things to say. This is going to take a while whilst I get the slideshow up. So if you just bear with for a second. There we Sometimes technology can be quite needy. There we go, sorted. I'm going to switch off my video for this, and then I'll be back when we finish. So thank you very much. Really happy to be joining everyone to discuss behavioral science and how it may support crisis comms. This is a very short introduction really to what behavioral science is for those who may not be in the know. Before we kick off, just a quick introduction on Lynn PR. We are an award-winning, full-service, data-driven strategic communications and behavioral insights consultancy, and we work across both public and private sector, creating meaningful campaigns that work, specifically ensuring the audiences pay attention, they engage with content and messages, and they finally take actions. So what are behavioral insights and why are they important? Behavioral insights, in a nutshell, help unlock how people make decisions. So it provides a much deeper understanding of both the conscious and the unconscious motivations that drive decision making. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. But behavioral approach to communications can help your audiences adopt more positive behaviors, which can then improve their lives. And ultimately, it's all about understanding the user in their local environment. So at Lynn PR, we apply a combination of behavioral science, which is the umbrella body, but also behavioral economics and nudge theory to our client's context, alongside a robust application of data and strategic communications and marketing to strengthen our content, to increase the visibility of calls to action, and ultimately to encourage audiences to take action and adopt positive behaviors that improves their lives. So we're here to talk about behavioral science and comms. We just want to stop and put a pause on audiences for a minute, and how we must make an effort to understand their behavior. So understanding audiences is critical to effective communications. It is really important, first and foremost, to understand who they are, how they will reach a desired outcome, and what barriers exist that might stop your audiences from reaching those desired outcomes. And it's important to use insight, data-driven insight if possible, to understand some of that. Because by finding out more about your audience's attitudes, their habits, and their preferences, as communicators, you can ensure that communications remain relevant, meaningful, and as effective as possible. Pardon me. So defining, identifying, and mapping audiences helps us understand them. A strategic approach to audiences helps assess current levels of the relationships and what they mean to you as an organization. Identifying priority groups or stakeholders helps clarify who can positively or negatively impact our organization and its reputation. So this is Crisis Comms 101. A combination of audience insight and strategic thinking helps build constructive relationships, can turn critics into advocates. It can ensure that the right message reaches the right individual at the right time, and it can ultimately boost communications programs to deliver outcomes with organizational impact. But before all of that, or maybe after all of that, we need to understand their behaviors, our stakeholders' behaviors, if we are to connect with them in meaningful ways. So this is not always about what they do, such as their engagement with you on your social feeds or even their responses to calls to action. It is also an understanding of the subconscious motivations and biases that exist in all of us as a species, and the opportunities and the challenges that these present, especially to us as communicators. So the more we understand how our audiences both consciously and subconsciously behave, the choices they make, the way they perceive our content, our creatives, our communications, the better we'll be able to design environments where our audiences can thrive. I know we've got a global audience today, so not many people will know who this gentleman is. This is David Halpern. He is the chief exec of the Behavioral Insights team, known as the Nudge Unit, was the first behavioral sciences unit in government back in 2010, which has now influenced over 200 other similar units to spring up across the world. So he says that, do we stumble blindly, or do we seek to understand these influences and choices? So pre-pandemic, when I was doing these talks, it was great because I could run a few scenarios and see the expressions on the faces of the audience, which I can't do right now. But I will paint a few scenarios for you to reflect on whether you've been in any of them, because I guarantee that everyone here today has either been an accidental nudger or that they've been nudged themselves. So I'll describe these scenarios, 3 scenarios, fair warning, all pre-pandemic scenarios, so they will make you nostalgic for pre-lockdown. But if this has happened to you, feel free either to pop it in a comment or just internally reflect. Scenario 1, you've met someone for the first time, and it could be for business or personal reasons. Perhaps a bit more applicable, this scenario in the UK and in Western countries. I'm from India myself, so I can't see this replicate very much in India, but we'll see. So you've met someone for the first time, you're in a pub or a bar, they buy the first round, so you feel inclined to buy the next. Scenario 2, you're at a train station or airport, your fellow passenger taps you on the shoulder and asks if you could please keep an eye on their bags whilst they pop to the loo. Normally you wouldn't notice, but now you're extra vigilant. And scenario 3, so you're visiting somewhere new. Gosh, don't we all want to do that now? And you're, walking. You're trying to find this nice restaurant to sample the local cuisine. You're walking down this cobblestone path. You stumble across this bistro. Really love the look of it. You look at the menu. You really like what the menu says. You really want to try it out. Just to be safe, you decide to just check them out on TripAdvisor, and you realize that their rating is quite low. So instead, you decide to choose from the top 10 restaurants in TripAdvisor. So if any or all of those scenarios seem familiar, that's because we nudge and are nudged on a daily basis. That's how our brains are wired, and we don't even pause to notice it. So as a human race, we've been nudging each other for as long as we've existed. We are constantly persuading and influencing those around us. But when it comes to programs and policy, we prefer to view our world through a rational, a logical lens. So this is, again, as I said, it's a whistle-stop tour. So I could talk about this slide for about an hour. But this is about thinking about why we have this need to focus so much on efficiency, productivity, and not enough on creativity. The reality is that as a species, we have both conscious and unconscious motivations. There are things that we do quite decisively, like fill out a form or compare the merits of 2 products for overall value. And there are also some things that we do quite instinctively, like detect that one object is more distant from the other, depth perception. Or we understand sentences in the languages that we speak. So I'm speaking to you right now, and I'm hoping that you're not having to exert a lot of mental acumen to understand my words, perhaps the context of it, but maybe not the words. So if that's the case, then why do we have this need to be logical? And the simple answer is that you can never get fired for being logical. If you use economic theory to propose solutions, and economic theory does tend to view life through a rather narrow and rigid lens of what should be versus what is. So Homo economicus versus Homo sapiens. And if your solutions then don't work, the likelihood is your senior executives will understand and shrug it off. You probably won't attract much blame. However, the opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea, said the very wise man, Rory Sutherland, who, if you don't know who he is, he's vice chairman of Ogilvy in the UK. I would definitely recommend following him on Twitter. Narrow conventional logic is the natural mode of thinking, but the problem with that is that it will get you to the same place as your competitors. And testing counterintuitive solutions and catering for irrationality can take you on a real journey with your audiences. So just to give an example, you just by flipping the order of a list can make your audiences perceive the list in a completely new way and behave in completely different ways. So when I was previous to my role at Lynn PR, I was at Cardiff University, where I was head of comms for alumni relations and fundraising. And we found that when given the option, our alumni, so our graduates, preferred to give us their email via a letter in the post. That sounds absolutely bonkers. But we knew that because we tested it. And because we tested it, we had some of the UK's highest engagement rate in the sector. So finally, just the last example before I wrap up. If you were in a room of executives that was trying to come up with a new soft drink brand that would compete directly with Coca-Cola, how might you advise them? You'd possibly say that we need the new drink to be tasty, possibly tastier than Coca-Cola. We should make sure our new brand is more competitively priced than Coca-Cola. And they should be packaged in a way that looks like it's real value for money, right? Now, what if I told you a brand did the exact opposite of those things and managed to give Coca-Cola a stiff competition? The drink tasted, exact quote from the market research report, kind of disgusting. It came in a tiny can and was exorbitantly expensive for what it was. I'm assuming you can guess the brand that I'm referring to. It's Red Bull. And it's a really good example of what happens when you embrace irrationality and when you test. So the case study of Red Bull is now studied globally by psychologists and behavioral scientists as a real example of how some of this counterintuitive thinking can impact human decision-making and improve outcomes for organizations. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, but if anyone wants to grab contact details, it's on the screen. Let me stop sharing it. Stop share. I do this so frequently, you'd think I'd know how to run these things. There we go, I'm back.
That's brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Shayoni. So I was going to say, one of the key bits for me, I suppose, in all this is whether we have overusing the phrase behavioural science, and if we don't really, I mean, you've given us a really quick kind of look at what is very in-depth sort of subject. But do you think it's become an overused phrase that perhaps we don't really understand the full details of?
I think behavioral science is perhaps treated as a magic bullet, where people think that if you understand human behavior, you will be able to improve outcomes quite naturally and quickly. And I think there is confusion about what behavioral science actually is. So there's a lot of confusion about the difference between nudge theory, which is a particular theory, not necessarily the whole domain, and versus what that means to behavioral economics or behavioral science generally. So I think literacy is unfortunately low in the area, and that's down to the fact that resources, especially in the realm of communications, is not widely available. There's lots of really good literature out there if you're looking, but I suppose it wouldn't automatically come your way. And the reason I sort of specialized in this area is because it was a natural extension of being data driven at Cardiff University, and I started dabbling in it and was dabbling, and I was doing a few experiments here and there, and I saw the impact of those experiments, and I decided to upskill myself. And by that, it's as similar to communications, where you invest in your CPD, you build a community, and you ensure that whatever you're doing is as close to the science as possible. So I'm an applied behavioral science practitioner. I'm not academic. I don't have academic qualifications in it. But what that means is I am able to take academic theory and translate that to solve real world problems. So yes, there is confusion. Great that people are talking about it. I think this year has shown us that behavioral science can do so much for communication. So I'm looking for more people to embrace this way of working.
That's brilliant. And there's a few questions coming in that I'm gonna go to in a minute. But I suppose the key for me as a crisis communication person is whether you think that you can actually introduce this sort of approach to dealing with crisis, and if so, at what point you think you can best introduce it.
So we are living in the biggest human human experiment. No, I'm getting this wrong. We're living in the biggest behavioral science experiment in human history. So we've seen that behavioral science can absolutely support crisis comms. It has been front and center of response. It's going to be front and center of recovery, not just here in the UK, but globally. I think, sorry, Amanda, what was the second part of your question? I got very excited by my response.
Yeah, where you think it's best introduced, because obviously, you know, for me, I suppose you break it into three areas: the planning and preparing for a crisis, the being as we are in the middle of it, and then the recovery phase.
Yeah. So I think behavioral science is a methodology, and it's more about understanding what that methodology means. It's rooted in a understanding, appreciation, and application of data. So it's not just looking at numbers or vanity metrics, it's really interpreting the data to see what that means. So if you look at behavioral science as a subject area, you've got three key pathways, and lots of pathways, I'm simplifying. There's one which is called choice architecture, and that's about the environment where we make decisions. So if we can understand the decision-making environment for our audiences pre-crisis, so if that's in the planning stage, we can ensure that we are creating the most optimal environment for them in a crisis. So that's, again, preparedness, right? The second strand of that is an understanding of heuristics and biases. That's one strand of behavioral science works, not everything, but H&B is a very big example of cognitive biases. I'm sure you've all heard of this bias or that bias, you know, et cetera, et cetera. That's piece of that strand of work is called heuristics and biases. So if we know how people are likely to react in situations, because what we tend to do, we have two ways of thinking. We have fast thinking, which is where we're using our automatic decision making, which is the majority of the time. And we have slow thinking, which is where we're being reflective, what I talked about earlier, really going pros and cons and making these really considered decisions. The reality is that system two, our slow thinking, is quite lazy. So we get system one most of the time, which is automatic. By using the automatic decision making, which is how we are wired, it's how we've developed as a species, we tend to use a lot of mental shortcuts to answer questions. We don't know we're doing this. You know, it's not a conscious thing. Those mental shortcuts then result in these cognitive biases, which are errors in processing, really. So what that tends to mean really in practice is that we might substitute one question for another. So if we are aware of those biases in advance, if we can understand that strand of research, we can be prepared for it when we go into crisis. So there was already a lot of literature on pandemic when the pandemic hit. So the behavioral science unit was able to quickly activate and look at similar examples in pandemic situations to understand how people were thinking, reacting, feeling, behaving, to then create communications and policy decisions which predicted their behavioral outcomes. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, that's it's useful kind of. I could just take over, and I'm not going to take over because I'm going to just go to a couple of the questions that have coming in, and one of them is in what you've been talking about, how does it take account of what people say as opposed to what people potentially do?
Love this question. It's the best question ever. This is called the intent action gap. It's a huge issue in pretty much everything you can think of. So we have, there is a particular bias called the observer bias or the Hawthorne effect, where we tend to align more towards what we think people want us to say, the less anonymous we become. So when you are running focus groups, for example, and you can see people, whether consciously or unconsciously, people might say things that they expect you to say. And so the recommendation there is to try and anonymize your qualitative insights as much as possible, because then you're trying to give people that shroud of anonymity to really say what they feel. Equally, we often don't know how we might act. We have every motivation to do something in a certain way. Behavior is all about context. In a particular moment in time where we have to make a decision, we might behave in a completely different way. So we might think we never do that, but we end up doing it anyway. So there is always a gap between intent and action. And behavioral science is all about plugging that gap. How do we get people from intent to action quicker, faster, and in a way that is supportive of their outcomes?
Great. There's another question that's come in that was saying about obviously nudging the population during a crisis, and how can we better use it in any area of life that has public safety dimensions to it, and mitigate ever minimize a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, behavioral science again is a way of looking at a problem. So it can be used in any context, really. It's just looking at a problem through the lens of human behavior, as opposed to perhaps economic theory or establish other models of X. With public safety, public behavior, absolutely, it's just about understanding what the behavioral objectives are. So if you want to do X, what does that mean from a behavioral term? What are the actions associated with it? And then analyzing what the barriers to that behavior might be, to then design interventions or solutions that can overcome some of that. And key to anything behavioral science is to test, adapt, test, learn, adapt. I think that's the phrase from Nudge Unit. I always get adapt and learn the other way around, but I'm fairly sure it's test, learn, adapt. Yeah, it must be.
I mean, it's interesting because when you're in the middle of pandemic, and obviously we're looking at what benefits there can be in nudging people in certain behaviours, seeing it writ large, like you say, with the what we're living through. And Chloe's asked a question, obviously, which I suppose a number of people will have, which is how you manage the ethical implications of nudging people to make certain decisions or behave in a certain way.
Yeah, well, you won't be surprised. I've heard that question many times before. It's a huge issue, and I think it's something that's absolutely right to address. There is from a behavioral science perspective, there's a lot of work being done around ethics and how do we ensure ethical approach is applied. Behavioral science, like all science, is about the application. So it ultimately sits with the person who's applying it. So just like with communications, the onus of ethical approach is on us as a communicator. We should behave in an ethical manner and we should hold strong to our ethics. It is similar in behavioral science. So the onus is really on you to ensure that you're using behavioral science to improve lives. And that's definitely the philosophy behind behavioral science and Nudge. So Richard Thaler wrote the book Nudge. If you haven't read it, please do. Signs of his signed copy saying Nudge for Good. So it is about improving outcomes, but ethics is an issue. And within communications, as vice chair of the BI in PR panel, the Behavioral Insights in PR panel, it is something that we are looking at to see how we can make that more salient to comms practitioners here in the UK. But absolutely right question. Just be aware that you're nudging for good.
Yeah, great. There's another really good question as well that's come in, which is about when you're in the middle of something fast moving, a sort of crisis, what would you recommend as a checklist to sort of sense check what you're doing, even though you perhaps can't go into the kind of level of detail that you've been through with what you've explained so far?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I'd say what is the objective? What's the behavioral aspect to it? What are the barriers that people might come up? Is there a capability barrier? Is there an opportunity barrier? Is there a motivation barrier? And once you know what those barriers are, you've done a quick analysis, you can then say, okay, actually, we think that people in this crisis may not know where to ring. They might not have the hotline number. So how do we get the hotline number everywhere? Or people might feel that within this crisis, they need to behave this way because they're seeing people around them behaving like this. Let's promote the behavior that we want most people to adopt, which is safe for them.
Yeah, I was going to. There's another question I'm going to go to. I'm sort of drawn to, which is behavioural science a case of where a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing?
Yes. Because we see the reason I said Lynn PR. So my background, public sector, is I saw so many agencies who were championing behavioural science, which made me very happy. But when you actually investigate some of the work, it was in behavioral science. It was perhaps an application of a couple of books, maybe some application from Nudge, maybe some application from social proof, influence. And what happens then, and there's been a lot of literature around this, is if we try and rehash the same interventions, audiences will understand and it will stop affecting them. The reason interventions work, especially when they're hinged on heuristics and biases, is because it appeals to our subconscious or our unconscious brain. But if you see the same thing over and over and over again, you will be desensitized to it. So you will not react the way you would. So case in point, booking websites for hotels. If you go onto booking.com, you'd see flashing 3 people are looking at this, 30 people are looking at this. You've got 1 minute to buy it. If you don't buy it now, it's gone. It's the same thing again. So when you go in, you probably don't even notice any of that anymore. Yeah, it's fine. It'll still be there tomorrow when I look. So there is a danger if you are applying a small amount of knowledge and sort of claiming that that is the science, which it isn't. There's a reputational impact both on the behavioral science community and the communications community, because if we claim as communicators to be able to apply behavioral science and instead we're applying perhaps a very, very, very small percentage of it, and we don't get the outcomes then that science should bring with it, that has a reputational impact on us as practitioners. And what that means is if you're trying to then sell innovative concepts to your clients or to your senior leaders, they might say, well, actually, you tried that, didn't work, when actually a behavioral science approach might have been really solid.
Yeah, so sort of leading on from that, there's been a couple of questions from people about how you can learn more and what's the sort of path to learning and becoming an expert, or certainly becoming more proficient in it. And then I've got another question which I'll ask just after, sort of linked to that as well, which is about you've recommended one book already, which was obviously the Nudge book, but are there any other materials, books and things you could recommend?
Yeah, there is a lack of resources from a communications perspective, but there are resources if you go looking. There's so much out there. So I would say if you're starting, if you haven't, look at the book Nudge and Influence. They're very introductory, but they're very engaging. Some of the books are quite heavy, they're quite academic, and it might just, if you're not familiar with some of these concepts, which are oftentimes rooted in a lot of economics, it can be a bit overwhelming, certainly is how I found it. So I would say start with Nudge, start with Influence. Robert Cialdini has written other books. Richard Kassenstein writes, God knows how many books he writes in a year. He probably writes more books than number of days in a year. So there's a lot of literature just associated with those three authors right there. Look at the Behavioral Insights unit, the Nudge unit, who have a blog. They have a newsletter. They obviously have the EAST framework, which is the easy, attractive, social, and timely acronym. EAST framework was developed not for communications, but for policy. It was developed to get ministers to think about human behavior when making some of those decisions. So it is a very introductory framework, but that framework is a good starting point, and you can then build on it. If you're looking at a diagnostic tool to understand barriers to behavior, I would recommend the COMBI model. Again, Government Communication Service here in the UK has a lot of literature on using behavioral science in communications. They've just published a new guide last week, I want to say, which is on a practical application of behavioral science in communication. So that's sort of the very introductory pieces to get you going. Obviously, if you're intermediate or advanced, there are different places you can go. It is about CPD and keeping up to date with the latest research, which does also mean that you're having to read research papers. So, it is about consuming a lot of academic literature to ensure that you're understanding where some of these things to move. Behavioral science has a huge replication issue. So what works in one context may not work in another context. We're about to publish a blog today about something called weird communities on Lynn PR. Keep an eye out for that. But that talks about replication for a very big piece of work that has influenced a lot of this science. So think about research papers, think about books. From a podcast perspective, I'd probably recommend Katie Melkman's Choiceology. Really accessible, really engaging, and talks about a different behavioral science topic every podcast. Ogilvy in the UK also run O Behave, spelled with a single O, not an OH, which is also a really accessible podcast. Hopefully that helps. I'm giving you loads.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but I suppose it's finding something that you can perhaps relate to and sort of relate, you find easy to read through and help you into it. It's an interesting question that's come in. And
sorry, Amanda, can I just pause?
Yes.
Sorry, do this to say we run a newsletter as well.
You do, and I subscribe to it because it is a really good way of getting an update on.
We've got a list going out today, so I'm going to, whilst you ask the next question, find the link and drop it in the chat.
You do. I was going to say, one of the questions that's come in, which is interesting, particularly given the pandemic and the way that's kind of developed, was about the spread of misinformation and how biases can contribute to sort of obviously making the situation worse, and how then I suppose can behavioural insights, behavioural communications help with that?
Misinformation and disinformation. Right? It's a really interesting question. So with misinformation and disinformation, we've, again, on Lynn PR, we've done a blog on it. So if anyone's interested, feel free to go have a look at it. But behavioral science can play a huge role in it. And that starts with being really transparent and factual about Sorry, I can't get this link for you. Apologies. I'll get it to you after this. So there's a big piece that behavioral science can do to get to misinformation, disinformation. It starts with co-production. How do we work with communities to build and develop messages so there's trust in those messages? Obviously, we've seen trust really plummet in this pandemic. I think in October it was 30% or something like that in the UK. So how do we build trust with our community? So co-production. How do we ensure that any misinformation, disinformation is quickly, immediately, and transparently dismantled? So that's, again, really important, to be really quick with your facts, to be very transparent with your facts is really, really important. And I think the final thing is to understand who within your communities are influencers. And in behavioral science, we call them validators. Who are these validators? Who are these people that your community perhaps trusts more than you? And how do you use their support to amplify your messages?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, there's really solid crisis comms, principles as well within what you've just said. So I can see huge kind of synergies there. And interesting, somebody was just trying to open a hornet's nest, if they've said about comments on the current COVID approach. But I think you kind of, you can or cannot answer that, and depending on how you would wish to. But whether there is anything that you would, rather than kind of to dissect, because that would be put you on the spot, was there something that you would have liked to see sort of happen or to do, or anything that you've been involved with that you can talk about that you think has been beneficial?
Yeah, we've done a lot in COVID response, mostly in public health, but I would say, obviously, we saw the impact of behavioral science very quickly when the behavioral insights team, the nudge unit, developed those very memorable wash your hands type posters, the ones with the UV light on it. So that was done with lab testing, and that was really positive. The stay at home messaging was really solid. It told you exactly what you needed to do, and you stayed at home. So it was really solid piece of work. And I think we started then going downwards slightly with very confusing messages. Again, going back to trust, it's really important to be precise, consistent, and transparent. So if you waver, that's attributes to distrust. So we saw some of that. We saw this focus on the rule of three. So not in terms of social distancing, sorry, the communications piece, so as hands, face, space, wherever it was. So everything had to have the three, and that's really good. That's a good rhyme as reason. That's the effect that's known as, and that's good because it helps us remember and recall. But I think the government and the party in power have used that particular effect a bit too much, so it then starts losing resonance. The other thing I think, looking back, where we are right now in the pandemic in the UK, is a huge compliance issues with younger audiences, and that can be, in my opinion, can be traced back to when the government very early on said it doesn't impact younger audiences. So they anchored them to the fact that it doesn't really impact them. So obviously then it's much harder to pull back from behavior than it is to build a new one. So I think those would be my key insights around. But such amazing works happen at such speed. It's tough space to be. So it's easy to judge, and it's easy to say it could have been better, hindsight bias. But when you're in the thick of it and you're doing a crisis piece with a behavioral piece in a pandemic, it's not an easy job. So completely appreciate that.
Yeah, totally. I think everybody would recognise that. It's brought out some fantastic work as well, hasn't it, across the world. There's a really interesting question that's come in around, do the primary concepts of behavioural science apply to all cultures across the world? And you kind of alluded to it a little bit at the start.
Such a good question. Please, I'm trying to get this link. If you go to lynnpr.co.uk.
I think so. Don't worry. I think somebody's already posted it for you.
Thank you. I was trying to find it with my team who are clearly working on something else. Thank you. Yes. So if you do go on lynnpr.co.uk, or if you go to that link and sign up for the newsletter, which is coming to you this afternoon, there is a piece exactly on that. So I really don't want to spoil the fun, but the answer is no. And there is some really interesting research that was conducted in 2010, which talked about how some of the studies that we've grown accustomed to and that's shaped behavioral science may not be as robust in all nations and all cultures as it could be. So sign up. I'm trying to be good, given I should have had this link for you already, and you can see that later this afternoon. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things I wanted to ask as well was what you've talked about the opportunities and things that we can get, but what barriers do you think as communicators we may face in trying to introduce this sort of behavioural communications approach, and then obviously particularly with a focus on sort of being in the middle of some kind of crisis or in a difficult set of circumstances?
So the barriers, I think, will be, again, going back to what I said earlier, that economic theory versus counterintuitiveness. So you might have barriers in your senior management going, why the hell are you doing this? Why are you trying to test during a crisis? Why are you trying to suggest such crazy ideas? But some of those crazy ideas are born from those research and insights piece, where you go, actually, if we reframe this to say X, it might resonate more. And that may not be how your senior management might want to see some of that play out. So again, baby steps is how I did it at Cardiff. I started small. I did a bit of A/B testing. I got the results in, and I started building my program in. So the more results that came in that supported my way of working, the more my senior management were willing to let me explore further. Perhaps crisis is not the best place to start with behavioral science approach, so if you haven't dabbled in it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So this question coming in a crisis, is it not generally the case that people are looking for direction towards safety, security and assurance, which is possible? Is there a danger that a rush to use behavioural insights techniques, either in a pressurized situation or by those without expertise, will actually get in the way of fulfilling that basic kind of response? Sort of building a little bit from what you've just said.
So I think there are a couple of things. We behave in very different ways in a crisis, and it's individual, it's based on culture, it's based on experience, it's based on memories, it's based on so many different variants. So we are not homogenous, that's one. The second thing is that communicators are naturally behavioral scientists, because we use instinct in a good way. So we just don't know sometimes when we're doing certain things that we're doing behavioral science, but we are doing it. So it comes naturally to us. In the wrong hands, absolutely wrong. In the right hands, absolutely right. Because in a crisis, people might be seeking safety, others might not. So there are two types of risk. So again, going back to the pandemic, because that's where we are, risk science. There's two ways of looking at risk. You could describe risk and experience risk. So when this crisis started, back in April for the UK, March, April for the UK, we hadn't experienced the coronavirus before. We didn't know what that was. We didn't know what the risk was. We were told it was very risky. We were told we had to stay at home. We were told all of these things, but we'd not gone through it. So when we're in that situation of described risk, we tend to be quite risk averse. So we stayed at home and we stayed indoors and all of that, right? Where we are in the UK is we've gone back out of lockdown. We've gone in Wales, we're in lockdown, God knows what. We keep going back to normality, then stepping back. So we're going through a space where we are getting those little snapshots of how life was before the pandemic. And obviously we yearn for that, right? We want to go back to that way of living. We are also in a space where we've seen people around us get the virus. We might have got the virus ourselves. We might have had bereavement around the virus, whatever. We've experienced the virus now. So our perception of risk then changes. It becomes experienced risk. And when that happens, and the longer we live with risk, the more risk-taking we become. Because as human beings, we are drawn towards gratification, whether we like it or not. We prefer smaller, sooner rewards than larger, later rewards. Always a bit of a tongue twister, that. So we prefer, especially with certain audiences, again, going back to young audience, I might, fine, I'll die of COVID if needs be, but I get to hang out with my mates. Now that's an oversimplification, but that is how a lot of people behave and think. So a behavioral science approach in crisis by people who understand how behavioral science should be used, absolutely important. So in the UK, we've got SPI-B, which is the behavioral science unit that's advising SAGE and advising the government, made up of stalwarts of behavioral science through psychology, economics, etc., etc. And they are really predicting behaviors to say, this is what's going to happen if you don't do this. And if you did this, this is the outcome of that, which could save lives.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a key element as well that you can be used. That's the scenario planning. As in my in my crisis communication sort of at head, that's what you would want to be doing, looking at what the scenarios you might face and kind of bringing that into that. There's another question that's come in around whether there are any circumstances. You've said obviously there's some challenging circumstances when you to using a behavioural approach, but are there any circumstances you say you absolutely wouldn't be able to use it?
Wouldn't be able to use behavioral science. Well, sometimes, it depends how. Behavioral science is not about communications. It's only one output. It could be I think the question is sometimes, could there be situations where behavioral science communications may not be appropriate? Yes, absolutely. Sometimes when you do your diagnosis, you realize it's not a comms issue. It needs to be fixed in policy, or it needs to be fixed in the environment. And you go, comms is not going to fix this unless X, Y, and Z is fixed.
Yeah, so interesting on that as well is what skills you think a communicator needs really when you start looking at this sort of work and making that connection, like you say, when it's not a comms issue, it's going to be an operational issue of some description.
So I'd say for comms practitioners, there's definitely first and foremost interest in human behavior. With an understanding, it's not a magic bullet. It's actually a lot of work. Secondly, an understanding and appreciation of data. If you're scared of data, this probably isn't the field for you, because when you go into test, that's where you're looking at what the data tells you. Whether you're doing a lab experiment or whether you're doing a field experiment, you're getting data back, and you have to analyze that data in a certain way and code the data in a certain way to make sense of it. So I would say an interest in human behavior, an understanding of data, and the third one, which is my favorite, is an absolute self-awareness and openness to be wrong. We go in and we say to our clients, we think this is the problem, these are the interventions, then we test, and we always test against control. And if the audience tells us if they like it or not, and if they don't prefer our interventions and they go with the control, that's fine, and we are absolutely fine to be proven wrong, but at least we've tested it and we know it works.
Wow, that is a bit different, isn't it? Being open to being wrong. We don't like being wrong. I think we often say that as communicators. So we've got a couple of minutes. I'm just trying. If anybody's got any last minute questions, I've just said or anything you think I've missed that you posted. One thing I've got as well is just around the behavioural approach and how that you include listening within it.
Yeah, I think, do you mean social listening?
Yeah. I mean, because we've talked a lot about nudge people and, the data and things like that. But then there's a bit of me that always wants to listen to what people are saying. And
well, I suppose in some ways, I mean, you've got your communications approach of using social listening, and there are tools that help you do that to understand and check sentiment and check, the government have their own rapid response unit to fight trust and mistrust, distrust, misinformation and disinformation. I'll get my words right. But equally with a behavioral science approach, listening is that test phase or real-time monitoring where you're looking what the data tells you. So that's you listening to your audience to say, actually, this message is not landing because the audience aren't doing what we want them to do. And we've got the data which shows the journey from when the audience saw a piece of content to how they behaved. And that's, sort of not quite listening to what they're saying, but listening to what they're doing. So then back to the intent action gap.
Brilliant. Right, I've got one last question we'll squeeze in that I think I've missed, and then I'll ask you for a short answer to the question that we posed at the start of this. So, which was around when we talked a bit about disinformation and misinformation. So, whether you think that online censorship, given that social media kind of focused a lot of things it has, will help or not in that sort of circumstance?
Oh, that's a big question for the final question, Amanda.
I know. And you've got a couple of in just 30 seconds.
I was doing so well. So there are two different issues here. So online censorship is, I think what we're talking about is private companies banning X, Y, and Z because of how governments in countries are treating them and making them responsible as publishers. Is that right?
I think it could be a number of things. Dave, I'm not. He's posted the question, so I'm not quite sure whether, you know, because whether it's you've obviously got Facebook, just pulling out of Australia in terms of news, but then you have got a lot, particularly over the last year, where Twitter and Facebook and others are starting to take more action.
I think so. This is not a behavioral science question. I think more stratcoms and just general strategic stuff is the fact that it is absolutely right to stop misinformation and disinformation. The way Facebook and social platforms work is they're quite algorithmic, and they use the algorithms to prioritize content to place in front of you that would boost engagement. Now, we know all of this, right? So if that means that they aren't doing their duty of care and wittingly permitting content that is fake, that might have huge impact on things like elections or public health, and they're doing that to secure engagement, which will then ultimately lead to revenue, that's wrong. So putting a stop to that, absolutely yes. Yeah, I think that's a big question to get into right now.
I know, yeah, it is. It's a huge one, isn't it? Okay. So, and then my last question, which I'll give you, and then we'll kind of draw it to, there's been some fantastic kind of insights, and I think you could probably talk for a long time about the whole subject, is going back to can communication really change behaviour in a crisis?
Yes, we're seeing it happening. I mean, 6 months ago, no, 12 months ago, maybe even longer, told behavioral scientists, you got the Western world wearing masks, we'd laugh. And look at us here wearing masks. So yes, it can.
And something I think perhaps we all need to make sure that we're considering as we move on from this and live through the rest of this crisis and beyond. Shayoni, there's fab feedback. People are really saying really helpful. I know that you could talk about so much.
Well, I don't know if people have signed up. I'm doing a GCS, Government Comms Service event at 2:00, but it'll be a repetition, so probably don't turn up for that.
Oh, don't say that. But yeah, I was going to say that there is so much. Please check out, obviously, the link I think is in the chat around Shayoni's newsletter that they produce. I'm just going to say thank you ever so much again. I'm just going to make you aware of a couple of the other. Let me just bring them up on screen. There's a couple of additional. There we go, webinars that are coming up. One on the 2nd of March, same time, 12 noon UK time, which is looking at resilience during a crisis. So not just in terms of having that time before a crisis, but actually in a crisis. How do you keep building your own and your team's resilience? And then an interesting one, which I really am going to have to try and get my head around, I think, on the 4th of March, which is looking at artificial intelligence and what that means in terms of crisis and how that looks.
Thank you so much for having me, Amanda. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm so glad so many people could join.
It's been brilliant, and I think great level of discussion. So if you want to know any more in terms of crisis comms, I put a lot of stuff out about that. This is my little bit just to give you an update. If you haven't got a copy of my book, you can get a 20% discount using that code. I do a monthly crisis comms newsletter looking at a case study, which comes out at the start of every month, as well as a number of other kind of documents and things that are available, and they're all free. And I also do a newsletter, but that's really if you're interested in looking at crisis risk and recovery. So I will send details around. I'll send details around of the links as well for Shayoni stuff, and you'll get a recording of today. I know a few people have had to come and go, and it may have arrived late, so you'll get a recording of today. And on that, I'd just like to say, hopefully you found that hour really useful. I do. I found it really useful. I've got so many ideas of what I need to go and do. And that's reading and understanding and looking at those research papers and things that you're recommending, because I'm not going to blunder into trying to do things at all at this stage. I think, like a lot of people, you want to understand a lot more about it. So thanks ever so much again, Shayoni, and have a good afternoon, everybody.
Have a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye-bye.